The purpose of this lecture is to compare and contrast various characteristics of maxillary and mandibular molars. The hip hip hurrah part of the slide refers to an old Trident chewing gum commercial where the dental professor approaches his class and says, "Today we are going to talk about molars," and the whole class spontaneously erupts into celebration. I don't expect that will happen here, but I do hope that you will become excited about the idea of being able to compare and contrast maxillary and mandibular molars at the end of this lecture. So we will begin with the maxillary first molar. The maxillary molars will erupt at about 6 years of age. In fact, in general, the first molars, are the first permanent teeth to show up or erupt in the mouth. Usually the mandibular first molar is the first one to erupt. And as you remember, these teeth are accessional teeth, first molars, because they do not succeed a primary tooth. So maxillary first molars, actually all molars are accessional, and they are the first permanent teeth to erupt in the mouth, oftentimes with no loss of a primary tooth. Eruption is 6 years. The mesiodistal diameter is about 10. The buccolingual diameter is 11. So you can see that the tooth is wider buccolingually than mesiodistally. It has 3 general roots, a mesiobuccal, a distal buccal, which are both about 12 millimeters in length, and a lingual root, which is fairly prominent and is 13 millimeters in length. The heights of contour on the crowns of these teeth are in the cervical third on the buccal, and in the middle 1/3 in the lingual, and the proximal contacts, which also correspond to the height of contour on the mesial and distal surfaces, are in the middle third, perhaps towards the occlusal part of the middle 1/3 of the tooth. Generally, maxillary first molars will have 5 lobes. Some will have 4, but generally they will have 5. So in this slide, I would like to emphasize that we have the first evidence of calcification is at birth. So this is a tooth that primarily will develop and calcify just after the birth of the child. Enamel will be completed in 3 to 4 years. Eruption is 6 years, and the root ends are completed about 9 to 10 years. Now this is a generality that you should remember for board examinations, that if you can remember the eruption sequence of the tooth, or the eruption timing of the tooth, the root will be completed generally 3 years, 2 to 3 years or so after the eruption of the tooth. So the tooth continues to form at the root end for 2 to 3 years after the tooth emerges or erupts into the oral cavity. So this is an interesting slide that contrasts 2 different presentations of maxillary first molars. In general, maxillary first molars will be either rhomboidal, and remember rhomboids are like a parallelogram, which is demonstrated here in the top slide, being more rhomboidal. And here on the lower slide, you can see that we have a tooth that resembles more of a trapezoid. So in this case, actually, the dimension of the tooth is wider on the lingual than it is on the buccal. That makes this tooth trapezoidal. The reason for this is the 5th lobe, which is the cusp of Carabelli trait. Some populations have this trait very prominently, and some populations it's not so prominent. In fact, in this tooth here, we're kind of missing that 5th lobe a little bit, so there really isn't the Carabelli trait that we see here, and that's what makes the tooth more rhomboidal as opposed to trapezoidal. The general sequence of cusp size that I want you to learn for these is that the mesiolingual cusp will be number 1, the mesiobuccal cusp will be second in size, the distal buccal cusp will be about the same size or slightly smaller, and then the distal lingual cusp will be fairly prominent as well, but this will be the fourth relationship, the fourth smallest cusp next to the cusp of cerebelli, which of course would then be the smallest usually. It has prominent developmental primary grooves. You have a buccal groove, you have a central groove here that separates the mesiobuccal and mesiolingual cusps. You have this very, very prominent oblique ridge on a first molar, and remember that oblique ridge is not the union of two triangular ridges. It is a union of the cusp arm of the mesiolingual cusp fusion, generally fusing, although in this case we don't have it fused, it's got a groove crossing it, to the triangular ridge of the distal buccal cusp. So the cusp arm, distal cusp arm of the mesiolingual cusp joining the triangular ridge of the distal buccal cusp. In many instances, this tooth will not have a groove crossing the oblique ridge. If there is a prominent groove crossing the oblique ridge, it is named the transverse groove of the oblique ridge. Now we have a distal occlusal groove that we can see here at this part, and then it transitions into a lingual groove, again, primary developmental groove. You can see that this groove pattern actually extends almost down onto the root form of the tooth. And if you can see here, there is a definite centering of the lingual groove on the crown from a mesial distal dimension. In many cases, as we said, the oblique ridge is not crossed by a groove, and what you will end up doing restoratively is you'll end up putting two separate restorations in this tooth if there is occlusal caries. So you'll do a restoration that will be in the central groove portion of the tooth, and then we don't cross the oblique ridge most of the time with our preparations, and then you'll have a distal groove, distal occlusal groove portion of the restoration as well. Two separate restorations for molars with prominent oblique ridges. This is a very strong chewing tooth. In other words, it's one of the first permanent teeth to erupt in the mouth, and so it actually does the job of chewing longest generally if it remains healthy over the life of the individual. Now let's look at proximal views of the maxillary first molar. You should be able to tell whether you're looking at the mesial surface or the distal surface of the maxillary first molar by two prominent observations and two prominent characteristics of the teeth. While the buccal roots are generally 12 millimeters in length, they are quite a bit different in terms of their relative size buccal lingually. The mesial buccal root is quite a bit wider, as you can see here, than the distal buccal root. And so that's a direct tip-off when you're looking at a diagram or an extracted tooth to understanding which proximal surface you're looking at. You can see on this illustration the proximal contact area is pretty well marked out. This is the distal contact area. Obviously, this is the mesial contact area. As you can see, it's slightly buccal to the central groove, and it is kind of occurring at the occlusal portion of the middle 1/3 of the crown. So that's pretty important. Height of contour here is in the cervical third, as you can see. The height of contour on the lingual surfaces of most maxillary teeth is in the middle 1/3 of the crown. Remember, your supporting cusp area here are lingual cusps, and so the height of contour tends to go a little bit higher. There is a structure called the root trunk that you need to be aware of, and this is the space between the CEJ and where the root bifurcates. The root trunk is smaller on maxillary first molars than it is on second and third because these roots on the first molar are very flared. If you can see the prominence of this lingual root, palatal root, extending out beyond the crown form of the tooth in most instances, and then having a facial curvature at the end is pretty typical. But as you're looking at extracted specimens, you can see that on the maxillary first molar, in other words, easier to compare against the second, the root trunk will be shorter on the first molar. The palatal root will be very broad and extend out beyond the crown form here, as you can see in this area that differentiates it from the second and the third molars. Again, the mesiobuccal root will be wider in the buccolingual dimension than the distal buccal root. This is interesting because in many cases when we study the pulpal configurations, there will be two canals in the mesiobuccal root. There'll be a MB1 and MB2 as it's called, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about roots and pulps, but as compared to just one canal in the distal. The other characteristic that we wanted to show you, which is, again is a little trick for tooth identification, is if we sight over the marginal ridges, you will generally see more of the occlusal surface over the distal marginal ridge than you will from the mesial marginal ridge. And so when we actually look at extracted teeth here in a bit, we can see that the mesial marginal ridge is slightly higher than the distal marginal ridge in terms of what you can see of the occlusal surface. Now we'll turn our attention to the maxillary second molars, which comes a little bit later. The eruption of this tooth is 12 years, so we call these 12-year molars generally. The calcification evidence is usually around 2.5, and you'll see that the roots again are completed 2 to 3 years past the eruption of the tooth. This tooth, like the first molar, has 3 roots generally, although in many cases these roots will be more fused, so they will not have the spread or the root bifurcation in many instances. The buccal roots being 11 and the lingual being 12, so a little smaller. The mesiodistal diameter of the crown is 9 generally. The labio or buccal lingual diameter is 11. So again, the crown is wider facial-lingually than mesiodistally. Now let's look at this slide comparing first, second, and third molars. So this is the first molar here, maxillary molar, and you can see there's a general trend when we follow the relative sizes of the distal lingual cusp as we go distally. So generally the distal lingual cusp will be larger in the first molar than it is in the second, and then it is in the third, as you can see here. In fact, in many instances of second and third molars, this distal lingual cusp will be so small as to make the tooth actually more resemble a heart than is the first molar, which of course we called that either rhomboidal or trapezoidal. Finish my arrow here so we know that we actually have a heart. And this actually, if you compare again the outline form of the molars in the first molar being trapezoidal in this case, you can see that there is a phenomenon that I didn't talk about in the last slide of watching the surfaces of the mesial and distal surface actually will converge to the buccal. Normally teeth will have a lingual convergence to the mesial and distal walls, but in the maxillary first molar you can see if it's trapezoidal like this, it actually has a buccal convergence, where other teeth that are more heart-shaped or rhomboidal shaped will have a lingual convergence of the mesial and distal walls. So generally the 3 cusps that we hold together are the mesiobuccal, the mesiolingual, and the distobuccal form a trigon. It's a very strong tooth to chew. The oblique ridge on the second molars are less prominent, more oftentimes crossed by a groove, transverse groove of the oblique ridge or even the central groove, and we make a transition from rhomboidal to trapezoidal on the first molar, to rhomboidal to heart-shaped on the second molar, and then the third molar can be any configuration. There's a lot of variation in third molars. So if we talk about tooth identification, I will not make you identify a third molar as such. Let's look at this diagram of maxillary second molars. Again, this is more of the heart-shaped variety. As you can see, there is really no prominent oblique ridge on this specimen. Fairly large central groove coming through, but again, the same characteristic. Strong buccal groove, as you can see here. The distal occlusal groove that you see here is less prominent, and you can also see that the lingual groove in this case actually becomes a distolingual groove and is not extending down into the crown form very far. On the first molar, the lingual groove, will extend all the way down onto the crown form and even extend into a concavity onto the palatal surface of the root. This tooth has a longer root trunk, not as much spreading or bifurcation of the teeth. So the teeth tend to be, or the roots tend to be more fused and closer together and less prominent actually than the first is. Now let's turn our attention to the mandibular first molar. As we said previously, this tooth erupts at about 6 years of age and is the first permanent tooth generally to erupt in the mouth. Since this does not create a loss of a primary tooth, in other words, the molars are accessional, since there's no loss of primary tooth associated with this, parents may not really realize that their 6-year-old has a developing permanent first molar. And so this will sometimes be surprising to them when they think that their child has just got primary teeth. If you'll notice, the mesiodistal diameter of this crown is about 11 millimeters and the buccolingual diameter is about 10.5. So this makes the first posterior tooth that we've come across that is wider mesiodistally than buccolingually. As you remember, in general, the premolars and maxillary molars are the opposite. They're wider facial lingually than mesiodistally. You might also remember that your maxillary central and lateral incisors are also that have that same characteristic, being wider mesiodistally than buccolingually. The root length of mandibular first molars is around 14 millimeters. There are two roots generally. There's a mesial root and there's a distal root with a furcation in the center. The height of contour on the buccal is in the cervical 1/3, and in the lingual is in the middle 1/3 occlusal gingivally, or even a little higher than that. Proximal contacts, again, are in the middle 1/3. As you remember, all teeth are rhomboidal. Mandibular molars, mandibular posterior teeth, are rhomboidal when you look at them from proximal view. And so this is pretty characteristic here, where we have the buccal cusp here and then the lingual cusp out. But the important thing is that we see that the height of contour is a lot higher here on the lingual surface than it is on the buccal surface. The buccal cusps in this instance are the supporting cusp. The lingual cusps are out of the occlusal table a ways to help hold the tongue out of the way. So they have an important job as well. This tooth will have 5 lobes. So as we look at the anatomy of this will discuss the lobe structure of the first molar. So if we look at this diagram of mandibular first molars from various views, we can easily see the two root structure, the mesial root and the distal root. The mesial root being quite curved. In fact, if you look at the diagrams in Wheeler's and in your 3-dimensional tooth from your Evolve website, you can see that there are concavities on the mesial and distal roots that are quite significant. The distal root is usually a little straighter. You can see that there is a furcation involved here, so if we measure the depth of the furcation, that's usually about 3 millimeters from the cervical line to the depth or the point of the bifurcation in this tooth. In maxillary molars, that's usually around 4, but in mandibular first molars, this is usually around 3. We have three prominent, definite cusps on this tooth. The mesiobuccal, the distal buccal, usually sequenced in about that size. Mesiobuccal and distal buccal is a little smaller. And then we have the smaller cusp back here, which is called the distal cusp. The lobe form is defined by the primary developmental groove. So we see a lingual groove here that separates the mesiolingual and the distal lingual cusps, which are about the same size. And then we have a mesiobuccal groove and a distal buccal groove that show the differentiation between the mesiobuccal cusp, the distal buccal cusp, and the distal cusp here, as you can see. You can see nicely the height of contour being in the cervical third here on the, when we look at this tooth from the mesial, and in the middle 1/3 or slightly higher on the lingual. You can see that when we look at the height of the marginal ridges, you can see more of the occlusal surface from the distal. That's a pretty typical characteristic. The lingual groove and the mesiobuccal groove will actually extend down about 2/3 of the way on the crown form to work with this. The primary root structure again is two roots, a mesial root and a distal root. These roots can also be bifurcated in a facial lingual dimension, and the tooth can have 3 or even 4 roots, although that characteristic or that finding isn't very frequent. Most of the time you'll have 2 roots. There will be 2 canals, a mesiobuccal canal and a distal, or a mesiobuccal facial canal and a lingual canal in the mesial root, and then usually a very large or ribbon-shaped root canal in the distal root. The mandibular second molar has many of the similar characteristics to the mandibular first molar. The eruption is generally 12 years old, again in keeping with the second molars being the 12-year molars. The root is completed usually 2 to 3 years past the eruption of the tooth again. The mesiodistal diameter of the crown is slightly larger than the buccolingual diameter of the crown, although not quite as, it doesn't look as prominent as it does on the first molar. 2 roots, again, a little smaller diameter of the tooth, and otherwise pretty similar characteristics. Very easy. As I said, this is a pretty easy tooth to identify in that while still being rectangular in geometric shape, if we look at it from the occlusal view, the tooth is divided by the primary grooves almost into quadrants, so into 4s, and we'll oftentimes call that groove pattern hot cross buns. So the mesiobuccal, distal buccal, and mesiolingual and distal lingual cusps are fairly close to being the same size. A little less spread of the roots aren't quite as prominent. There's no distal buccal groove on this tooth because there's no distal cusp, it's just mesiobuccal and distal buccal. Again, you can see more of the occlusal surface over the distal marginal ridge than you can the mesial marginal ridge, but identification of this tooth is again primarily from the occlusal groove configuration on the occlusal surface. If we go back a little bit to the mandibular first molar and we look at this outline form occlusally, we can sometimes think of this being a pentagon. So if you look at that again, we're wider mesiodistally than buccolingually, but because of this little carving right here from the distal cusp, this tooth will actually look like a pentagon, somewhat. Mesiobuccal, distal buccal, and then you have your little distal root right there. Primary groove structure, central groove, mesiobuccal groove, distal buccal groove, lingual groove. Okay, that's the difference between the first and the second molars. So I hope you've enjoyed your presentation regarding the characteristics of maxillary and mandibular first and second and third molars. I hope you're giddy with excitement over the prospect of learning more. They tell me in this slide that if everything's going okay and you're not under stress, that you should see 2 dolphins. If this is not the image that is presented to you, you might consider that you are being under a little bit too much stress and you should take a break. I think you probably want to take a break and read your Wheeler's book and be ready to answer specific questions about the characteristics of the maxillary and mandibular molars, permanent molars. We'll talk about primary teeth here in the upcoming near future. Thank you.